Hello, and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I'm Anna.
And I'm Victoria.
And we are excited to have you with us today. If today is your first day with us, we are educators who share a passion for reading and all things literacy. We've come together on the podcast in an effort to better understand the newest research around reading pedagogy. We've noticed a trend toward more phonics and foundational skills instruction and less emphasis on content knowledge, language development, meaning making, and effective expression. So to make sense of it all, we're interviewing experts from across the nation with extensive knowledge in literacy and multilingual education to have discussions about how to support our students, specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate.
But today, Anna and I are making meaning. So here we are at episode 12. We are at the halfway point of season 1 of the Effective Literacy Podcast. So if you've been with us since the beginning, you know that Anna and I, we work with these researchers, we talk to them, we learn so much from them, and then we sit down and we make meaning of it. We have been in education collectively over 40 years, and we know that anytime we read a book, we go to a conference, we get these opportunities to talk to these edge-celebrities. We need to sit down and make meaning of it to really better understand, to stretch our thinking, to think, what does this mean for me in my classroom, at my school? What should I do? So today, we are making meaning of our conversations with Dr. Jim Cummins. If you haven't already listened to episodes 10 and 11, we really recommend you go back and really listen to those before this. But at the same time, we're not going to boss you around. If you want to listen to Making Meaning first, go at it.
Absolutely. I think it is important, though. I'm going to boss you a little bit. Jim Cummins' work is so important and so deep that Victoria and I are going to do our best to make meaning of it. But really, I think it's important that you hear from the primary source first before going to the secondary source. So just from a learning perspective, you're here to learn and really think about your own practices and pedagogy and how it's going to impact our work. I highly recommend you listen to those first. And if you've already listened to those and now you're percolating and thinking about everything that you just listened to, we welcome you here with us today. Before we get into what he talked about, I do want to just kind of activate some prior knowledge, right? Best practices when we're teaching. If you were listening to his podcast and thinking, gosh, why do I know this name? And, I know this name from maybe my undergrad or my credential program work. Or if you are a family member and thinking, gosh, this guy, who is this and what's his work and how has it impacted education? I was just chatting with Victoria before we started recording today, and I was saying, his work, I can explicitly remember back in the 90s or so, as I was in my undergrad at San Diego State and in my my second language acquisition theory classes, his work coming to the forefront and really driving so much of our learning. And so much of his work in our became foundational in how we were providing language instruction for our English learners. So just to give you a little reminder, if you went through the credential program, remember that idea of the BICS and the CALPS, or the playground language versus the academic language, and how when students are learning the additional language at school, that BICS, or the basic interpersonal communicative skills, or we just commonly call kind of the playground language or the social language, that oftentimes that's developing first. And then students were really digging into as they become more proficient in the additional language. Then we're working on those CALPS, right? That academic language proficiency, more connected to the cognitive demand of the language tasks of the content. And while we know that multilingual learners develop language in a really complex way, and it doesn't look the same for all of them, it's important for us to know that some of those foundational theories of how we teach and explicitly teach English to our multilingual learners really is based in the work of Dr. Jim Cummins. So if you were listening and thinking, gosh, I really know this name, or if this is all brand new to you, that just gives you a little background knowledge on the depth of his work and how foundational it was. And I just think it's really amazing that was a long time ago that I was in that. And yet he continues to stay relevant, as well as think about how does this new research then impact what it is that we're doing now. So I really appreciate the time that he took with us and helped really kind of explode our brains a couple of times as well.
Yeah. Anna, I get the opportunity in my day job to work with Dr. Lori Olson. And Dr. Olson is always advocating that we have to understand the history of our English learners, right? And the history of our English learners in the school system. And every time she talks about the history, right, she talks about Dr. Jim Cummins, Dr. Stephen Krashen, and in the late 70s and 80s, that they were the researchers like charged with figuring out how do we do it? What is the success? What does it look like, right? To make sure that we're meeting all of the needs of our English learners. So it's exciting to have Dr. Cummins on. And I'm gonna jump around a little bit, Anna. We answer 2 questions on these making meanings. We answer about how do these help us better understand literacy and what am I still thinking about? I want to jump to what am I still thinking about, because the thing that's really resonating with me is how frustrated Jim was that we're talking about this again. You know, he kept talking about like he's been doing this work. And he's like, I've already said, we can't just have a one size fits all approach. It doesn't work. We can't just say our students don't know how to read because of phonics, because of foundational skills. He's like, it's vague. It's limiting policy. Like there's no one single approach that's going to work for a full range of students in our classrooms. And it just like that frustration just really came through with me. And it made me think back to this whole like pendulum, right? And that you and I, even with our experience in education, we're still kind of baby educators, right?
Definitely.
I mean, yeah. I like to say that anyways, because it makes us a little younger, but right. We're still, I was in school during one of the last big switches, right? One of the big pendulums. And then I was just beginning teaching when that pendulum was going out of vogue, right? And now like Jim, he's just talking about like, we've already learned this. We've wasted so much money. Like he kept talking about the $6 billion that were wasted with the Reading First initiatives, and that it didn't work. And so why are we trying to do this again? Why are we trying to mandate foundational skills and phonics instructions in isolation?
In isolation and for specific big chunks of time, right? When we think about the kids' days and how many minutes, do we have to do things? And so oftentimes as a site administrator, we get that question, well, how many minutes do I need to teach this? And how many minutes do I need to teach this? And it makes me think, that's not, your kids aren't going to fit into 25 minutes of this or 47 minutes of that. We have to respond to the students. And I think that's what Jim was trying to get to too, is that if we become so prescriptive, then we're taking the human component out of the learner, that we're just thinking like, okay, what's the problem? Here's the prescription. And I think, and you're, responding to what you were just saying about the pendulum swings, and sometimes it's based on research and sometimes it's based on who's in charge. And it makes me just think, why is the pendulum swinging again? And is it swinging because we need to correct, or is it swinging because somebody pushed it? Right. So it just, for me as an educator, it makes me think, why are these changes happening? And are we really responding to the needs of the student? As I walk into classrooms, I'm thinking, okay, who are these kiddos and what is it that they need in here? And how is this teacher making decisions based on student needs versus a prescription of it should be like this, this, and this?
And I appreciate that imagery, right? And asking the question, why? It's so important that in education, we constantly ask ourselves, why? Why are we doing this? What's the purpose? What's the goal? What does the end outcome really look like?
For sure. And I think we're already seeing the impact in the classrooms, right? We're seeing teachers who are thinking, oh my gosh, I need to be doing more of this. I need to be doing more of that. And that's great. We want teachers to make decisions based on need. But where's the push coming from? Is it because you realize that your students don't have the foundational skills yet that you want them to, so you're going to increase your time or change the way that you're teaching it and, make it more accessible in a different way? Or is it because you saw something that said you're supposed to do it this way?
So Anna, I think with our podcast and with the inquiry approach that we're taking to really understanding this, I think maybe that's one of those whys we got to look at, right? Who or what pushed the pendulum? And I mean, I know that some people are saying, oh, it was the pandemic that pushed it, but like, this pendulum started being pushed before the pandemic. Right. And the pandemic just exploded it, like it did so many other issues in education. Right. It just brought them to the surface. But I think we got to start thinking about what is pushing the pendulum.
And that kind of takes me to one of the things that I'm considering to think of or keeping thinking about is this idea of saturation, right? Saturation of literacy, that literacy saturation that he talked about. It's not just happening during the language arts block, that it's happening all day long, and we saturate, like literally fill them up until they can't take anymore. You can't just do that during that time of teaching language arts, that it needs to be happening all day long. And we take those opportunities then to resaturate during science or to resaturate during math or social studies.
Yeah. And you know what? I have to advocate for my secondary people as well, right? Because so much of secondary, right? Like the phonics and stuff aren't part of our standards. But we do talk a lot about like syntax and sentence structure and grammar aspects. And like what happens is like when I'm teaching like the sound and the fury, right? And the sound and the fury, there's an entire chapter where there isn't punctuation or there's very limited punctuation. Like every year when we get to that chapter, the students are like, I don't know what to do. So we really have to, like, in context, take that moment and break up that grammar, right? And really break up what's happening here. How do we know that the thought patterns change without that movement of the period? But the other thing that happens in secondary, right, is if my science counterpart notices something that's happening, like, communicate with me, communicate with our designated ELD teacher. Let's work as a team, right? And really work with the language in context. That if we see a problem that's occurring, let's address that, right? And if as an educator, you don't feel efficacious addressing it right then, don't let time go by. Go and talk to your colleagues, right? Jim kept talking about this like community that we have. And that he also talked about like the creativity of educators. And Anna reminded me so much of you and me. And that like when we experience a problem, we go to each other. Right. We go to each other, we balance it out, we get creative, we think, we stretch our thinking, and we find something to address it. And I think that in secondary and in elementary, right, we've got to make sure that we're using our colleagues, that we're talking about it. Like, hey, are you experiencing this problem too? Like, how could we address this? What could we do to really support our students? So, Anna, I want to transition to our other question, right? But how do these episodes help us better understand literacy? What's one of your big thoughts?
I think the idea of the saturation, I know I just talked about that, but I think for me, I was a liberal studies major, so with an early childhood emphasis. So I've been in this concept of like creating a print-rich environment for my entire educational process myself, and thinking about how I was going to set up my classroom. And then as a classroom educator, as well as a professional development provider for, my entire career, creating a print-rich environment has always been something that we can do to be kind of that additional teacher in the classroom. And how are we building on what kids already know? How are we making access with anchor charts that they can then use during literacy time? But this idea of literacy saturation, to me, just takes it to a much more active place, whereas I feel like the teacher is often creating that print-rich environment. You may be using student work to do that, but for a student, you're sitting in that, and maybe that is passive. There could be moments of active engagement with that environment, and that's good practice. But this idea that we're creating a literacy saturated environment and that it feels more active to me. And when I'm thinking about walking into any classroom at a TK5 school, at my school, that's really what I'm looking for, is how are we not just posting student work on the wall, but how are we using language, using foundational skills, using content knowledge to saturate our students in literacy skills, not just explicit phonics or decoding or comprehension, but really thinking about all of the components of literacy and just saturating students in that all day long, which to me feels more not just active, but also more comforting. right? Like if I'm an emerging reader, that maybe I'm not at grade level, if I feel like literacy is surrounding me at all times and it's just something that I'm in, then I feel more comforted in my emerging skills because they're always there for me. The literacy is always around me, and eventually I'm going to get there. It's not something that I only access during language arts time.
Right. Anna, I love how you're always making these connections. But I immediately got thinking about like, what if I don't have the funds to create that print rich access in my classroom? And I just want to call out, there are a lot of funds at our state levels right now, a lot of federal funds. Really, whatever state you're in, do a little bit of research. We here in the state of California, there's an art, music, and instructional materials block grant right now that totally you could use to buy these books to create that literacy saturation, to make sure that you have that literacy socialization in your classrooms, in your schools, in multiple languages. So the funds are out there. So again, talk to other educators, talk to your principal, really say, let's find out what funds could we use to make sure that we have all of the print here in our classrooms. The other thing is we have to give a shout out to all the digital print, right? I think that almost every single classroom right now has some computers, some iPads, some sort of technology. What libraries could we subscribe to? What ways could we make sure that there's lots and lots of print available in that digital form if we don't have it in the print form?
100%. And I think that at a lot of sites, it's just school sites, we need to start having these conversations. How are we prioritizing? And by prioritizing, I mean like setting dollars aside for that literacy saturation, because you probably have a curriculum, a state adopted curriculum that has some alignment to other content areas, right? A lot of times the readers in one adopted curriculum can connect to another part of the day, but are there opportunities for us to expand that? And like Victoria said, if you are looking to increase that digitally, is that something that maybe somebody at your school site already knows? Is somebody at your school site already accessing, Overdrive through their local library and they put it on the iPads? And is that allowed? Sometimes we have to get approval from technology, right, to put new apps on the iPads. But something like that, those are conversations that we need to start having if we're going toward that goal of literacy saturation. And from my perspective as a site administrator, I think that those conversations are only going to move us in the right direction. And if somebody's coming to me saying, how can I saturate my classroom in literacy more? That's the conversation that I really want to have.
Yeah. So, I love that Dr. Cummins used literacy socialization and literacy saturation, these terms that I'm like you said, there's something that we've been focusing on, but we've never named it that way. But it just reminded me too of all of our other guests, right? Dr. Lori Olson was talking about the importance of tapping into libraries. Like Dr. Esther De Wong was really talking about all of the stuff that we have to do to play with language, right? And have those books and have them in multiple languages. We also had Dr. Jody Slavic, who was talking about how language, we have to interact, we have to dramatize, we have to use lots and lots of words and like the vocabulary, which it made me think about like when Dr. Cummins was talking about vocabulary, right? And about other research that I've read that we know that for anyone to really have a word seep into our lexicon, we need to be exposed to that word at least 20 times. And if it is not your primary language, that 20 times is almost double. So like by creating these classrooms, we're creating that opportunity to be exposed to these words, right? More and more, because I'm just going to say as a teacher, making sure that a kid has 20 exposures to one word is a lot, right? How am I going to do that? But it's like, how do I do it? I make sure that there's these words everywhere, that we're constantly using words. We're playing with them. We're talking about them. We're talking about the words that we're using in our phonics instruction, in our foundational skills, and our grammar aspects, that it's not just a one and done vocabulary word on the board.
Yeah. And I think in context is really important, right? Because you can just flashcard kids or have them match a word to a definition and do these different activities on a worksheet 20 different times. But, where's the transfer? How does that transfer to something that's meaningful for me? How does using that word help me to better explain what it is that I'm talking about, or to more accurately connect to that time in history that I'm trying to explain to somebody or show that I truly understand? So that transfer of knowing that language, of that vocabulary, is really, really important. So this idea that we're using it in context, using it over and over. Yes, do you have things on the walls and that kids can see and learn how to spell, but at the same time, why do I need that word? How does that word help me to be a more accurate writer? Or how does that word help me to engage my reader when I'm writing? That purpose and that relevancy around instruction, it's kind of similar to what I was saying about the phonics instruction. We can do things over and over and over and over. And I hate to, but when we drill kids over and over and over without any context, they check out, right? Unless it's relevant for them. But when we use those words in context, or we use them in a story, then kids get excited. They'll be like, oh my gosh, Miss Blitzky, there's our word, and right? And now they're excited about a word, versus just take your pencil. Now you have to read the definition and make a line all the way over. Like, that doesn't show us they're excited about that word. That doesn't show us that they're going to make those real connections, versus when they see it in the real world, or when you throw it into the conversation that they're having, those eyes light up. And now they're excited about that language.
And I think it's so much more about, like, can I identify a word or can I use a word?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right? When you can use the word and use it correctly, like, that's really when it's part of your lexicon. So Anna, you brought up the big word, history. Can we just talk about Jem giving us that beautiful history lesson of the English language?
Yep.
Oh, it made me geek out. I was so excited. And I know that I started talking about, like, my students and teaching Chaucer, but it was this whole moment of really going back to this idea of, like, this hybrid language that English is, right? And that English is not just in isolation.
I think, yes. And I think I told you this before, but when I went back and listened to the episode again, I cracked up at myself, because after he finished talking about the history of language, my brain was saturated. It was so saturated and, like, exploding. I could not even comprehend it all at one time. So now, in listening to it over and over and over, it also helps validate the complexity of what we're asking our multilingual learners to do, right? That we're asking them to, because language is changing and happening right now. Like, I even think about every year, the dictionary comes out with, okay, here's our words of 2022, and we're going to add them into the dictionary. So language is literally living and growing and changing and adapting, and has been for thousands of years. So as we think about explicitly teaching language to our students, monolingual students, it's complex. And multilingual learners, it's very complex. And I think that complexity can sometimes get smoothed out for some of us who maybe just kind of move forward and, okay, I got to teach this language and I got to teach this vocabulary and I'll do this story. But really thinking about what he was saying and how language has changed over time and how it will continue to change allows us to just, like, take a step back and breathe in the complexity that we're trying to do, and validate the work that it takes for us as teachers to explicitly teach language and reading and literacy, and the challenges that might take. And so this is hard. That's why we're doing this work, right?
Right. Yeah. The validating, right? It's teaching's hard work. It's hard work. It's fun work. It's exciting work. It's creative work, but it's hard. And we need some validation from here and, from time to time. So Anna, we're getting close to the end of our time. Are there any last thoughts or anything you just want to emphasize or resonate with for a moment?
I think the idea that does continue to stay with me, and like literally last week I was working on, was something that, like you said, we're hearing some common themes, right? We're hearing common themes from Dr. Lori Olson. And how are we opening our libraries after school? Are we engaging families in literacy practices? Are we creating that sense of belonging? And when we talked to her, that really resonated with me. And now really thinking about, I think Jim said, using explicit language to welcome the home language. So how am I, as a site leader, communicating that to my teachers? That we want to make sure that, like, during conferences, that they're having these conversations that explicitly say, we welcome the home language, and here's how we can create some of those partnerships. And then for me, as I set my family meetings or set invitations for families to come to school, how am I using explicit language that really ensures that families know that we welcome that home language and that we want to partner with that?
Yeah. With that note, Jim said, how are we tapping into the funds of knowledge, right? All of that family knowledge, that experience that our students have, like, how are we making sure that the parents and all of the funds of knowledge that our families are bringing are part of our literacy community? And I think it's a really intentional point that we as educators need to make sure, like Dr. Olson had said, that there's a clear invitation. That it's an invitation and it's not just a one come to our literacy day, right? It's like be part of that community.
Right. So Jim had talked also about that we need to think about how are we inviting our families to come into the classroom with the home language. Are they reading a book? Are they doing an activity with our students? And I think, we see this in the California Preschool Learning Foundations, that we always want to have an opportunity to connect with families and to connect with the home language. And as a monolingual teacher, if I don't speak the primary language of some of my students, then how am I explicitly inviting families to come in and share, not just kind of moving past in addition to, I would say, the traditions of like food and holidays. But if we're really talking about literacy and honoring language, then number one, does my school have books that then a family can read to my class? Because that's really important in honoring. And do I have time set aside in my literacy time or in my social studies time or somewhere in my day where I can make sure that opportunity is there, and I'm creating a really clear connection to families' home language and making sure that it's explicitly connected to in our classroom?
Absolutely. Well, so with that, I'm going to thank you for listening. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast, and we are so honored that you're making meaning with us, right? That we're a big community, and we want everybody to make the meaning together. So if you need more information about us, or you want some of the access to the resources mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you're listening to us. All right, until next time, we'll see you.